everybody. My name is Jonathan Bean. I'm one of the co-founders of the Heterodox Campus Community at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. You can find us in the chat. There is a link to our website to find out more about our organization. We are a faculty-driven group that brings viewpoint diversity, which unfortunately has become a partisan label these days, but bring people with different viewpoints to campus. Uh, People will have something to say that's more than just the run-of-the-mill consensus. That's why we're the heterodox community. And today I'm very happy to have Adam Szetela, author of a new book just out in 2025. Um, that book is dangerous. How moral panic, social media, and the culture wars are remaking publishing. It came out. Is it MIT with Penguin Random House? Did I
Yeah.
get that right? Okay.
Mhm.
There's been a lot of buzz about this book. The Washington Post said it's fiery and insightful. Publishers Weekly said it was a great cutting debut. Um, Adam has a PhD in English from Cornell University. Those are his academic bona fides. Before that, he was a visiting fellow for the program on the study of capitalism at Harvard University. He's the author of the book I just showed you. Um, he's written for the Washington Post, the Guardian, Newsweek, and many other publications. His book is an expose of the censorship that's been kind of routinized, part of the bureaucracy of the publishing industry. Um, so he takes an internal look at how the publishing industry is really censoring and filtering and making sure that authors go through sensitivity readings, which Adam can tell us about. And at the same time, social media has had a kind of a toxic role to play in policing literature from the outside and making publishers do some of these things that they do. Um, but before we dive into your expose, Adam, you saved your acknowledgments for the end of the book, and I was kind of intrigued. You said that my writing style has been more influenced by my passions, the ultimate fighting championship, bodybuilding, skateboarding, mosh pits, rap music, stand-up comedy, and my blue-collar upbringing more than
Mhm.
any other writer. Can you tell us a little bit about that? How that shapes who you are and why you wrote this book?
Yeah, so I mean, as far as style is concerned, the review outlets have sort of described my book as polemical. I think the Washington Post called it pugnacious. I come from a background where, I grew up in Boston, greater Boston, very working class household. My parents didn't go to college. There's sort of like a way of talking, in that community that I think was a lot more direct, a lot more, this was not, a community of helicopter parenting and safe spaces and things like that. So I've always appreciated that in other people's writing, as well as in other art forms. And, I'm someone who, like everyone else who has written, I have seen people trash my work. I have seen people, critique my work. I've never been deterred by someone taking sort of like a more confrontational, direct tone with me, and that's sort of the work I like reading. Now, obviously, like I have an academic background, and that doesn't tend to be how one is taught to write in academia. From my experiences in academia, I see a lot of, someone has to list off the 15 things that they valued about another scholar's work before they offer like a mild critique of it. And I think maybe there's a time and a place for that, but I think with other situations, it's important to call a spade a spade. So that's kind of the background from which I was coming.
Okay. Are there other pugnacious writers that you can cite that you say, I enjoy reading this person?
Yeah, I think Adolph Reed is really amazing.
Oh,
He's
yeah.
a political scientist. I think he just retired from Penn maybe like 1 or 2 years ago. Super brilliant guy. So, someone I would encourage a lot of people to read. He's pretty influential in political science, but I don't think he has quite sort of got the broad attention that someone like, say, John McWhorter has gotten, who I also think is a great writer, very sort of similar style. Yeah, those guys are great. Some other people off the top of my head, I think Batya Ungar Sargon, former deputy opinion editor of Newsweek. I think she's a really great writer, really smart intellect. Yeah, so those are, some of the people I grew up reading. And by grew up, I mean, in the past 10 years or so since I entered
So,
college.
so, so people like Reed and McWhorter, they're on the left, but they're often very critical of the left, and we see that in your book as well.
Yeah, so Reed, I think, would identify as like a Marxist, or
Yeah.
I mean, he's very class focused. McWhorter, it's my understanding, he's probably more of like a liberal moderate. But yeah, I think they do share a critique that is different in many ways, but they are, critical of the, you know, side of the political spectrum from which they come out of. And, I'm the same way. I wouldn't identify as a Republican or a conservative. At this point, I honestly identify as politically homeless. But I came to this because I was noticing, real problems on the side of the political spectrum that I have, long been associated in many ways.
So your opening, I thought, grabs a reader, grabbed me at least, with an absurd but all too common first the cancellation of a book, and then its rebirth after it goes through a grinding sensitivity reading. And this is about Emily Wen Shao's Blood Air book. Can you tell our listeners about that controversy?
Yeah, so this was early 2019. There was a debut author. His name was Amelia Wenzhou. She's someone, as far as I can tell, is very left of center, particularly when it comes to cultural issues. She herself is Chinese American author, was born in China, came here, and her first book was about to come out. It was a fantasy book. From my understanding, it got a good advance. There was some, buzz around it, and months before the book came out, people had started posting screenshots of her jacket cover and the book's description. So people had advanced reading copies of it. And the thing that they were focused on was the fact that this was a fantasy novel. And it was, according to her, set in a world that has slavery, but it was slavery that's not based off skin color. And people were posting this and saying that Amelia Wenzhou was culturally appropriating African American slavery as if that's the only form of slavery, and that to write about slavery in a fantasy novel is appropriating that if you're not African American. And people were also saying this whitewashes slavery and race, like the idea of having slavery that is not race-based. So, I mean, to normal people, this is just, it's not even going to make sense how something like that could be racist. But in this world where a lot of these hyper liberal people are very active on social media, some of them are very good at organizing campaigns against books, not just on Twitter, but on places like Goodreads, where you can organize three, four, 500 people, 1,000 people to leave one-star reviews of a book before it even comes out. So the publishers are listening to these people, even if their arguments are, as nonsensical as those. And what happened to her was she and her publisher canceled the publication of the book. They sent the book to sensitivity readers, who we can talk about, to sort of like vet the manuscript for potentially problematic material. And then it was later published, right? Now, one of the most interesting things about this case is there was another author of color on the left. This guy's actually a sensitivity reader. His name's Cosco Jackson, and he was involved in the sort of online mob that went after Amelia Wenzhou's book, calling it racist, calling it all these other things. And then just a few months later, the same thing happened to him. His own book was about to come out, and people started saying that it was Islamophobic, that it was problematic. And his book was never published. It was written. I actually own an advanced reading copy of it. It never saw the light of day. So, I think those two examples back to back, they really speak to some of the broader issues, which is like this is a very sort of insular culture of hyper left, often very educated people, and their guns are often just pointed at each other, and they're canceling each other.
Yeah, I think you used the image of a or the metaphor of a circular firing squad.
100%, yeah.
Yeah, because it's usually people on the left that are paradoxically targets. Did any of these people issue these? We've got some good examples of cringe apologies.
Oh yeah.
Somebody says, I confess, I need to be educated. I need to do the work.
Yeah, yeah.
I need to be a better person. I mean, it's very reminiscent of I teach a course where the Soviet show trials come up, and
100%.
exactly what happened. So did these people do that? Did they
Yeah.
go through this ritual?
Yeah, so Amelia Wenzel, I think her apology is still posted online. She uses the words, I think the words she uses are not offense, but pain, harm, these really like inflated sort of moral words, right? At one point I was actually going to work with someone who does coding to see if we could create sort of like an AI program to just issue these apologies. Because they are that formulaic, right? So like the authors will get accused, and it doesn't matter how ridiculous the claims are, right? If you use the magic words, racism, transphobia, whatever, authors will respond and say, I'm not sorry for causing offense or, like upsetting your sensitivities, but I'm sorry for the pain I caused, harm I caused. There's always a promise to do better. There's always a promise that they're listening. There's often a second apology, apologizing to the people who critique them for having to like get educated by them. But this has happened, as I document in my book, not just to authors, but even when like a book gets reviewed well and then the mob goes after it, you find reviewers apologizing for writing their reviews and contributing to harm with their reviews. And this is not at like, websites you've never heard of. This is at places like Kirkus Reviews, like places that librarians look to for purchasing decisions and things like that. We've seen it with agents apologizing. Yeah, it's sort of touched every corner of mainstream publishing.
So the people that are in the middle and are profiting from this, other than
Yeah.
publishers that continue to make money because they don't want to rock the boat, are these sensitivity readers. Tell us a bit about them.
Yeah, so if you go on X right now, what was formerly Twitter, if you search sensitivity reader, you'll notice that the term doesn't even appear until 2016. Now,
Yeah.
this is the same year that a young adult author whose name Justina Ireland, she created a database of sensitivity readers. And essentially, what a sensitivity reader is it's someone who shares a quote unquote marginalized identity with characters in a story. So if I'm a Black sensitivity reader, I could be a sensitivity reader for the quote unquote Black community. So Jonathan, who is white, there's this underlying assumption that Jonathan could never write accurate Black people, that he would just be stepping on landmines of offense. So I get hired to sort of point out where Jonathan is being quote unquote inauthentic or offensive or what have you, right? Now, the important point to keep in mind about sensitivity readers who are now being used by all the mainstream publishers as well as indie publishers. In 2019, I think the New York Times Union asked the New York Times to start hiring sensitivity readers. They've been used by academic journals, including, more scientific ones. Um, these folks, and many of whom I talk about my name, they're actually the ones sort of stoking the need for their own services. So when I was interviewing people in publishing, they were very clear that them hiring sensitivity readers, even though they didn't use this word, it functions as a kind of disaster insurance because they're all aware of these public controversies. They're all aware of white authors accused of getting it wrong, of quote unquote cisgender authors sort of messing up if they have a trans character or what have you. So these days, when you pick up a fiction book and you see an acknowledgement section that's like, as a straight white man, I just want to thank the three gay sensitivity readers I hired. Everyone's aware of the controversies in publishing, and these people are a way to sort of get ahead of the curve before a book is published, right? Because no publisher, no agent wants to see their book trashed in one of these social media brouhahas.
So this shows up a lot in your book with young adult literature. Is it infecting the broader field of literature?
The sensitivity readers?
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. So from my understanding, there's no corner of writing that hasn't been touched, right? So I forget what academic journals I mentioned, but there have been some who hire sensitivity readers. I actually think Science hired one. The mainstream journalistic outlets have used them, but I would say they're definitely most prominent in books that are geared towards young people, so young adult, children's, because it's this idea that these are people with not fully formed brains. They're more impressionable, so it's like even more important to like really, as they put it, get things right.
Mm. Um, and I don't know who it was that gave the quote in your book. You can't have characters say or do prejudiced things.
Hmm.
And because I'm a history professor, there's a lot of the material that I've dealt with and presented has people saying prejudiced things, people fighting against people saying prejudiced things.
Yeah.
So you certainly see that in history, and then of course you also see it with literary characters. Um, who was it that said that? Was it a publishing executive?
I mean, there's more than one person. I said it. I
Yeah.
mean, for me, as someone who, spent kind of countless hours interviewing people, the one that stood out most to me was I had the opportunity to interview an agent who's been doing this for decades. I can't list them by name, but there's someone who represents sort of like a venerable who's who of contemporary authors. And she was telling me, as someone who has been in this landscape for decades and really seeing how quickly things changed in the past 10 years, she was talking about like quite literally being in meetings where she is representing her author and representing the work. And people, often younger people, will point out something like, hey, this character is using, misogynistic language. And when she's telling me this over the phone, she's like, yeah, he's using misogynistic language. The book is set in 1875. Like that is how they spoke, right? But she's like, this stuff that 20 years ago when I was, when she's doing deals with publishers, it was like people weren't pointing out that stuff. It was understood, especially in the case of historical fiction, that yes, characters are not going to talk like liberals in 2025, right? But now there's this assumption that just having that is itself problematic, right? So like one of the things that's come up is like people are aware, right, that again, not every person in 1875 was talking about talking like a liberal in 2025. So how do you like maintain accuracy by still having these characters, right? Especially if you're, writing about a story set in, I don't know, all sorts of eras, the Jim Crow era of slavery, right? So now there's often pressure, right, for bad characters to sort of like get their comeuppance or to get kind of like privilege checked within a story. So if you're going to have a character who like says something racist or says something otherwise potentially insensitive, there needs to be another character to like point out how that character is wrong, is like not someone the reader should be looking up to or, otherwise putting value on, which like, I mean, we could talk about this at length, but obviously raises all sorts of questions for like the verisimilitude, the realism of literature, and it also like puts forth and has institutionalized a premise that I'm personally not on board with, which is that literature kind of first and foremost should be some sort of like didactic tool for people.
It sounds, I mean, you just mentioned how the privilege checking, and making sure that there is there's a moral to the story.
Yeah,
That sounds a lot like Hollywood's old production code, where there was
100%. Yeah.
so, and you talk about the comic code and the moral panic about comic books in the 50s. Can you relate how that's connected? That historical episode is connected to what's going on now?
Yeah, so for this book I use the conceptual framework of a moral panic. So within the sociology of moral panic, sort of like the SparkNotes version of how that is defined is a moral panic is an exaggerated response to a perceived threat. So there's been a number of moral panics, right? So like in the late 20th century, you had people worried that rock music was turning teenagers into Satan worshipers, but the one that I found most parallel was in the 1950s. You had comic books, particularly horror comic books, that were presenting women in sort of like more sexually explicit ways that had a lot of violence in them. It's sort of a new medium in many ways, and parents on both the left and the right were very concerned that these comic books were contributing to juvenile delinquency. So it was like this idea that if a kid reads a comic book where, there's a violent serial killer in it, then that is increasing the likelihood that they're going to be a serial killer. So eventually, the panic over comic books reached the level of the Senate, and there was a Senate hearing on it in the 1950s, and then it sort of like died down. I think the popularity of television sort of redirected people's attention. But the point was, like, there was this idea that literature, in this case, comic books, was causing like much bigger social problems, like youth violence and things like that. Now, in the present, the concern is not that, this YA novel or this picture book is causing juvenile delinquency or violence. The concern is that it's turning people into racists, turning people into sexists. And publishers, agents, professors, journalists need to be very vigilant about every text that a kid, but really anyone has access to. So one of the things I try to emphasize is that this like starts with concerns over young readers, but then it gets to the point where you have like The Nation publishing a statement of censure above a poem, saying it was, apologizing for publishing a harmful poem, right? So it starts to sort of expand its scope, and now all of a sudden adults are being treated like children as well.
It seems like this some have called it the Great Awakening,
Yeah,
burst on the scene in the 2010s or so. John McWhorter was a linguist and writes in many different contexts. Said that in the most liberal communities, these things wouldn't have been an issue even 10, 12 years ago. Um, so what's the cause of it? Is it just social media? Is it you put some of the blame on universities?
100%.
You know, people in universities complain about the corporatization of higher education, but then there's the universitation of the corporate world. So what is it? How big a role is social media? How much blame should we place on English departments, history
Sure.
departments, and so forth?
Yeah, I think there's like an overdetermined set of causes. So, I mean, me personally, having read, a million and one books about the Great Awakening, I think Jonathan Haidt's book is really great, coddling about sort of changes in parenting styles, things like that. I think The Rise of Victimhood Culture by Bradley Campbell, Jason Manning is really good. I think Musa Al-Gharbi's recent book, We Have Never Been Woke, is really good. And they all sort of like take a different sort of angle, trying to identify some causal explanations. But to your point, I think when I think about the Great Awakening, not just in publishing, but how it has affected all corners of society. I think universities have played an absolutely central role in that. So if you think about like what is wokeness or political correctness or however you want to define it, right? Wokeness as the left itself was using that term before it became a pejorative was like the ability to be more awake than normal people to like the more subtle forms of racism and sexism and the all the intersectional identity categories. And I think universities have been sort of the locus point for that, exporting that to other areas of society, right? Because if you look at the leading universities, look at Harvard, Princeton, Cornell, sort of like the arts and humanities and social sciences departments that have been sort of the leaders in academic scholarship, right? They're overwhelmingly left of center. It's not like Cornell English is hiring conservatives. It's surprising if they hire someone who isn't extremely left. Like if someone hires a Democrat, that's going to be potentially problematic, among other faculty who are like, communists. So the thing is, right, like there's something Emil Durkheim, wrote about when he was writing about religion, which is in a society of saints, the saints will crucify the least saintly. So that's why, like, when I was at Cornell, when I was at Harvard, like the definitions of what counts as racism and sexism and things like that are wildly different than, what I would find if I went down to the local construction site and asked a group of guys to define what racism is, right? So you have the university sort of creating these new definitions, things like that. But, it's also like each new generation is going through those universities, and especially like the Ivies, the NYUs, sort of like the elite universities, like those are where a lot of corporations, it's where Hollywood, it's where the New York Times are all like culling their next generation of creators from. So it doesn't surprise me that, like the same stuff that I was seeing on college campuses in like the early 2010s, all of a sudden you start seeing in the New York Times newsroom in like 2017 and things like that. So, even right now with people saying like wokeness is dead, wokeness is dead. I think it's dead in certain corners, certainly dead in the Oval Office, certainly dead in the new Secretary or Department of War, right? But, is it dead in the anthropology department at Columbia? Probably not. Is it dead in the philosophy department at UCLA? Probably not. Yeah, so, in the same way, it's like, where do you think the next crop of people working at Penguin Random House and Harper, where do you think those people are coming from? They're often coming from the most elite universities and English majors, and English itself is like an extremely woke field, arguably the wokest field.
Yeah. So you mentioned your time at Cornell. I was intrigued by your lab experiment, which reminded me of the Stanford prison experiment,
Yeah.
which listeners might be aware of. Tell us about your lab experiment where you could get students to think that Allen Ginsberg, the famous transgressive gay poet, was himself a homophobe.
Yeah, so basically, I was beginning with the premise, right, of when I looked at these social media brouhahas where all of a sudden hundreds, thousands of people would be saying a book is racist or sexist. It raises the question of like how many people actually believe what they're saying and how many people are just sort of like fitting in these liberal circles where it's sort of like, you want to be part of the in crowd, right? There's a hashtag silence equals violence, right? The idea that if you two aren't chiming in, then you're part of the problem, right? So basically, what we did is we recruited a random sample about demographically representative of the U.S. in terms of race, et cetera. And we gave these people a few poems. Three of the four poems were poems that have been accused of moral transgressions by the left in the real world. So, like, there was a poem accused of sexism, of anti-Semitism, of racism, and then we threw in this Allen Ginsberg poem that was just about shopping in a supermarket. And we gave everyone who took our short test a list of 16 word choices, and they were asked to click three to describe the poem. So like the word choices were aesthetic ones, like this poem's well written, this poem's beautiful, this poem's boring. And then we threw in some moral ones. So it was like this poem could be racist, this poem could be anti-racist, this poem could be progressive. And basically what we found in every example was like the overwhelming majority of people, like 90% plus, like no one is reading these poems as racist or sexist or what have you, like sort of confirming my suspicions that wokeness really is like a hyper elite sort of way of understanding the world. So in our next experiment, we recruited a different group of people. We gave them the same poems, same word choices, but this time we included criticism that we attributed to a famous, influential literary critic. And this was just like two sentences of criticism. It was criticism based off real world criticism. So like our participants would see a poem, right? And then they would say like, so and so made up name at prestigious literary journal has said that this poem is absolutely dangerous to like the black community, or this poem is so offensive to gay people. And then we also told our participants that at the end of the experiment, they might be asked to log into their Facebook accounts and enter a discussion about their choices. So now it was like their choices wouldn't be anonymous. There was like an influence, right? And what we saw was for every poem, the number of people accusing it of racism, sexism, homophobia, whatever, it just shot up in ways that were like well beyond sort of like the statistical significance one needs to publish an academic paper. And the most interesting one was this poem. You can look it up, Supermarket in California by Allen Ginsberg. It's a poem written by Allen Ginsberg, sort of 1960s radical gay poet. I mean, quite literally, he's anthologized in the Columbia Anthology of Gay Literature. He's someone who has sort of like all the left of center bona fides in the world. But when we gave this poem to the second group, I had written criticism accusing the poem of homophobia. And in the second group, about 30% of people agreed with that criticism and clicked homophobia. So, again, these are lab conditions. I don't think they actually remotely approximate the real world pressure that people feel to like join the mob and sort of like, as they say, appear on the right side of history. But it was really astounding where, I'm looking at the results and I'm like, wow, even Ginsburg can be accused of homophobia in this climate.
I think a few years ago, I don't know who did it, but the people were given a quote by Martin Luther King, and in some of the cases, it was identified as a quote by Martin Luther King. In other cases, it was identified as a quote by Donald Trump. And then the responses were quite different.
For
Uh,
sure.
so people can be led astray. But let's step back. Did this all come from a good place in the beginning? Was there work to be done?
Yeah, I mean, so like to the best of my ability, try to like steelman the movement that I am very critical of my book, right? So like to their point, it's absolutely true that when you look at all sorts of different data sets, whether it's like who actually works in publishing, who works in literary agencies, what kind of books have been published, it's certainly true, particularly when you look historically, right? That like most of the people who work in publishing are white. Most of the people who like occupy like the senior most levels, they're men. When people have done random samples of like children's books, particularly decades ago, and it's like, yes, most of the characters are white characters, things like that, right? So like, I don't think so again, give this like the most generous rating possible. I don't think the argument that is like, hey, there's a lot of black kids who read books. There's a lot of, Native American kids, gay kids, whatever. Um, it should probably be good for them like, let's make it easier for them to find, say, a children's book that has an African American character in it, things like that. Um, that, I don't think that's an unreasonable argument. And it's more of an argument of like, yes, and meaning like, yes, there's obviously awesome books that can appeal to a black kid, even if they don't have black characters in it. But again, like, W.B. Du Bois was writing about this 100 years ago, where he's like, hey, can we have, like some more books that depict like black kids in a positive way? But the thing is, it started with that and it really ballooned into something much more punitive, much more I would say like ideologically captured in sort of its demands, right? So now it's not just like, hey, can we sort of increase diversity? Which most people in publishing are on board with, even if they're highly critical of sort of like the more woke aspects of this, right? And now it's morphed into, what I was talking about at the beginning of this call, where if you have a fantasy novel that has slavery that is an African American slavery, that is somehow colorblind and recreating racism in the world.
Mhm. Um, but there's money to be made in some of this inclusive literature, whether it's good or not.
For sure.
Talk about people like Ibn Kendi, like a whole industry. Um, I think his book How to Be an Anti-Racist came out a year before George Floyd, but certainly it just took off with Black Lives Matter and the reaction to George Floyd's murder. Um, how many authors are entrepreneurs like, I think you call them entrepreneurs, right? Moral
Yeah.
entrepreneurs or um, who else is doing that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a term out of sociology of moral panic that is a term called moral entrepreneurs, and like these are people who experience a rise in status, a rise in income as a consequence of a moral panic. So even if they're well-intentioned, even if they're badly intentioned, it's sort of objectively that is what happens to them. So I mean, I think Ibram X. Kennedy might be if you want to talk about like the person who has benefited most from George Floyd's death, from the quote unquote summer of love of rioting, from, this moment where seemingly every white person with enough income in America was trying to root out their own racism. It's Ibram X. Kennedy. He's got like I assume he represents a huge share of Penguin Random House's profits, right? He's not just got How to Be an Anti-Racist. He's got Stamped from the just New York Times bestseller after New York Times bestseller. I think he's got like 8 books now, including a children's book that asks, children, I think it was like as young as 3 to 5 to confess their racism. So I mean, he's doing quite well. There's other people, the Robin DiAngelos of the world, but also a lot of people in, English who you've probably never heard of who were publishing books, especially from 2020 on, that are trying to say like literature is racist and we need to do something about it, right? There's all sorts of incentive structures for that, to say nothing of people who are being hired to come in and give their diversity training seminars at publishing houses, at agencies, and things like that. Like there's a huge economic component to it. Sensitivity readers are not doing their work for free. So, I can't mind read and ascribe intentions to people, but it makes sense to me why there would be, when people are, raising the question of whether, say, a mandatory diversity training seminar actually does anything, or they're saying like, hey, maybe Ibram X. Kennedy isn't actually the best person to read. I understand why there's pushback to that, right? Because regardless of what you believe or not, there's like enormous economic incentives involved in keeping the focus on America is the most racist, country of all time, and publishing is just absolutely infected with racism that needs to be weeded out by these figures who are offering their services and their books and whatever.
Right. Um, I mean, but there are people like John McWhorter. I remember when that moment was coming along, and
Sure.
he rushed out a book, Woke Religion, and he and others came up with a counter reading list, or at least a balanced reading list, because everybody was being handed a reading list. If you open your Amazon,
Yeah.
it was incredible. Now it's kind of dialed back because it was kind of over the top. Um, for those authors that might step over the line, and the lines are always changing, you say they could get whacked with something called a morality clause.
Yeah, so essentially, particularly sort of during this period of the Great Awakening, authors, and I'm not just talking about children's authors, I'm talking about really everyone, including people who do like nonfiction journalism. People started noticing new clauses in their contracts, particularly people who had been working with publishers for a long time. So one person pretty famously who posted about these, who has since passed away, was Ursula Le Guin, the great sort of Marxist science fiction author. She posted one on her website, and she was working with HarperCollins at the time. And she was kind of like, what is this? So essentially, these are clauses that are really, really vaguely worded. And I give, examples of what that language looks like in my book, but they've appeared at the big five publishers, at indie publishers. Um, the publisher that publishes like The New Yorker and Wired has asked their journalists to sign them. But essentially, these clauses say like, if an author comes into public disrepute, then the publisher can then take action, like canceling a book, suspending royalties, things like that, right? And it's not incidental when these clauses became so popular, right? It was a direct response to social media brouhahas and the publishers sort of protecting their bottom line, right? Because if we've invested money in Jonathan and he's about to publish a book, but then he writes an op-ed where, Roxane Gay at the New York Times says Jonathan is really a fascist and a racist. Well, me as my publisher, I might want to protect my bottom line if I think there's now a diminished sort of market for Jonathan's work. Especially because, again, this is often leftists critiquing other leftists for not being a leftist enough. So like I, by criticizing Jonathan, may have just wiped out, a portion of readers who are going to be interested in his work, right? But yeah, they're a real thing. From my understanding, their sort of origins are in Christian publishers. Um, and then they migrated to young adult fiction where they're very popular. But again, now they're at a point where we have found them in mainstream journalistic contracts. We found them in, people writing work for a general nonfiction audience.
Um, do works ever disappear? I mean, so there are works that don't get published.
Yeah.
There are works that an author, if they had more freedom, would write a different way. But now they have to pass through sensitivity reading. Are there attempts to like, well, I guess there must be attempts to remove books from libraries or
Mhm.
to have publishers take them off their list. Is that kind of thing going on?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly been examples of that. Like, I know if you look at like sort of the left-wing organizations, American Library Association, PEN America, organizations that are ostensibly nonpartisan, but if you look at their work, it's quite clear which way they lean, right? They have understandably devoted a lot of time to focusing on what they perceive to be like right-wing legislative censorship of schools, of libraries, et cetera. But some of these same organizations will give little to no space to the same dynamic that has occurred in the name of progressive values. So to like give you an example, right? When there was this brouhaha over Dr. Seuss's books, there's 5 Dr. Seuss books that, the left dug up and were saying, this is racist, this is offensive. And Dr. Seuss Enterprises, who has his estate, decided to stop publishing those books, right? But the thing is, there was also websites and even public libraries that then began to restrict access to those books. So, I'm in Wisconsin right now. You guys are in Illinois. I think Chicago Public Library System, from what I remember, actually pulled those books and prevented people from taking them out. And they were, they said they were trying to determine what to do with them because all of a sudden they were agreeing with the criticism that this is, I guess, like too dangerous for kids to have access to. So they were like, should we put this in the historical archive? What should we do with it? But the point is, people couldn't take those books out, right? I think it was eBay that prevented people from selling the books on their website, right? And again, we're not talking about firearms. We're talking about Dr. Seuss books, right? With the criticism being, like he depicted someone in a Eskimo jacket, and people found that to be offensive to, indigenous people in Alaska, right? But that's kind of like how moral panic works, right? In the same way, the book, I think, what is it called? Um, I forget the guy's name, but there's a conservative who wrote a book that was sort of critical of what they call transgender ideology, and Amazon pulled that book. So like these, especially in places that don't have access to like a brick and mortar, Barnes and Noble, and these other places, like people rely on Amazon, they rely on eBay, they rely on their public library system. So when you start pulling books in a very partisan way, even if the books like technically exist somewhere, you're ultimately sort of restricting people's access to books, which the left would say they're very much against, right? Which they are when it's, Ted Cruz.
Right. I mean, that gets to a real tricky issue. So historically, the people who argue that censorship is only government censorship were the
Right.
conservatives. So, they would be behind, the morality regulations of publishing and no pornography and, down the line. And it could just say we're bringing pressure to bear on publishers and retailers to do the right thing. But now you have the left saying, it's Amazon, it's not the government, or it's social content or social media moderators. They work for a private corporate. It isn't government censorship, so it's okay. Um, how do you deal with that? I mean, it's a real problem for classic liberals, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think that is a particularly strong argument because I mean, this is the way I look at it in sort of a consequentialist way, right? So like whether the government bans the book I was thinking of is called When Harry Became Sally by Ryan Anderson, who's a right-wing political pundit. So whether Amazon presents prevents me from having access to that book, because that's, say the only website where I can get that book, or whether the government does, like the end result is still you're restricting the circulation of information and things like that, right? So I'm less concerned with the means to do that. Obviously, I think government censorship is probably historically been the worst kind of censorship, right? But just because, the left is pressuring Amazon to remove a book and pressuring its public library to move a book, I don't think that like makes it somehow like less bad, right? And I think it's important to note that the left has been pressuring publishers in a way that the right has not. So in many ways, they're actually getting to books before they're even released to the public, right? So like when I mentioned Cosco Jackson's book being quite literally canceled before its publication, and the only version of that book that exists are a handful of advanced reading copies that people had, like reviewers and things like that. I was able to get my hands on one. But for other people, like that book does not exist. They're not going to get it. So again, like whether, that's government censorship or not government censorship, it's still doing the doing the thing that censorship does, which is preventing people from accessing views, stories, opinions that you do not agree with.
You would think that, so why aren't there competitors like rise up to say, hey, we're going to be a publisher? Barry Weiss did this with the Free Press. We're
Mhm.
going to have a different kind of journalism, and it's going to avoid some of these things, and we're going to do old-fashioned journalism and commentary. Why haven't publishers come up to say, look, we're going to publish the kind of works that are good, but other people won't publish?
Yeah, I mean there are examples of that. I think Skyhorse Publishing clearly fits that. So they've published like Melania Trump's memoir, which was a #1 New York Times bestseller. When Woody Allen's book got dropped by another publisher, they picked it up. It was a New York Times bestseller. Like they're not going to discriminate, against your book because it might upset people on the right or the left or whatever. There's been new publishers that have tried to get into the game. So like Heresy Press, my friend Bernard started that. It actually eventually became an imprint of Skyhorse. But the thing you have to understand, like, in the same way, like I could, in theory, start my own car company. It's like, am I going to be able to compete against Toyota and Ford and et cetera? And in many ways, the big five publishers, Hachette, HarperCollins, Penguin Random House, the sort of like New York City upper echelon. In many ways, they do have a monopoly over distribution, over access to bookstores and things like that. Now, to their credit, if you dig hard enough, you'll find they're like one conservative imprint, and it's usually a very profitable conservative imprint, right? So like it'll publish, the Ben Shapiro's, the Jordan Petersons, the Mike Pence's, because they know those books will do really well. But as one vice president or president who works on one of those conservative imprints told me, he was like, if we put this to a vote inside my publisher, it would overwhelmingly be a vote to disband that imprint because it's just so ideologically captured. But we're able to survive because we actually bring in an enormous amount of revenue.
Yeah. Um, you are sensitive, if I can use that word, to issues of class.
Yeah.
Um, you've got your own working class background, and you say, a lot of this is earlier in our interview, you said hyper elite concerns, cultural concerns, that kind of put them out of touch with the rest of America, the 90% in your experiment that didn't find certain things racist or sexist, but also doesn't deal with class issues in publishing or in higher education as well. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so if you sort of look at this movement in all corners, right? So if you look at the conversations on Twitter, if you look at what review outlets like Kirkus Reviews, Publishers Weekly, what they're focusing on, if you look at what's coming out of English departments, There is a hyper obsession with identity, but it's identity along lines of race, gender, sexual orientation, and so on. What you'll quickly see is there's not the same sort of emphasis on class, right? So, like, I use a number of examples to try to show what this looks like. So, this looks like submission guidelines at university magazines, which are often like really big stepping stones for people trying to get book deals, right? Saying things like, if you're black, you're a woman, if you're indigenous, like we waive submission fees for you, right? But we don't waive them if you're poor. You see this in terms of what sensitivity readers focus on. You see this when you go to manuscript wish list and you look at what agents are trying to get, right? So you'll see agents like quite literally saying, this month I'm only accepting stories from BIPOC women, right? You just don't see I'm only accepting stories from even people like whose parents didn't go to college or something like some sort of other marker of class, right? But this is all very interesting to me, right? Because inequality in publishing is honestly egregious. And when you look at like you can go to LinkedIn right now, go to indeed.com, type in what an entry level position or even a higher level, like an associate editor position at Penguin Random House and HarperCollins. Look at those starting salaries. You're talking about like $51,000 and you have to live in New York City, right? So then the question becomes, well, who's actually getting these jobs, right? And the answer to that question is, it's probably not the poor kid who is drowning in student debt, right? It's probably people who have a parental safety net. It's probably people from the elite universities where average student incomes are significantly higher than community colleges, state universities, and things like that, right? So I don't think that is incidental because again, like many other people, I think what is called wokeness, hyper political correctness, it is very much like an elite phenomenon. Like as these people themselves say, like they're more awake to what counts as racism, sexism, and I think personally, if there was more class diversity in publishing and sort of broader literary culture, I don't think this moral panic would have reached the level that it would have reached, right? But because things are so politically and economically homogenous, it has, right? And I think there's also just sort of like the people on the left are so obsessed with getting more Black people to work at publishers, getting more Indigenous people, et cetera. And my basic argument was like, if you actually created sort of like the economic infrastructure for poor people, many of whom are also people of color, to sort of succeed, then it would probably also be addressing your diversity problem, right? Like me personally, I don't think the reason that a poor indigenous kid who grew up on a reservation in South Dakota can't get a job in publishing is because publishing this hyper left, hyper liberal ecosystem is like really racist, and there's still like racism we need to weed out. I think it's probably because like most people who don't have rich parents, you're not going to be able to live on $51,000 a year in Manhattan or Brooklyn.
Right, right. So your book, I imagine you finished it in 2024 for the second.
Yeah, like around that time, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it comes out in 2025, and uh, you probably encounter people who say, "Hey, look, maybe you had a point during the height of the Great Awakening, but it's MAGA." Well, let me ask this first. I mean, do you think the MAGA backlash uh, is a reaction to this? And some people will say, but it's MAGA now that's the real problem.
Yeah, so I think there's two questions there. I'll take the first one first. So, I mean, I think it's as clear as day it's a backlash. I mean, you could take Donald Trump's campaign speeches and like, group them together and then put them in Chat GPT or like create a sort of like word frequency bubble. I mean, the amount of times that man says political correctness and wokeism, or woke or wokery or what have you. I mean, it's innumerable. I mean, he has quite explicitly verbatim said, let's get rid of PC, all this stuff. James Carville, the long-standing Democratic strategist who has worked with Clinton, Obama, both Clintons, he has said like there's few issues that are more universally hated than wokeness, right? And he's like, it's really like that one issue that the political right can campaign very hard against without alienating voters in the middle. So if they campaign very hard, against abortion or something, you're going to lose a certain constituency of people. But like everyone hates wokeness. Again, aside from the sort of people are part of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I'm just like, well, look at what Donald Trump campaigned on, right? Even if you look at his cabinet members, right? Like, so Pete Hegseth, he wrote a best-selling book about wokeism in the military, and now he's, from his perspective, weeding it out. No, I don't think like that those culture wars are incidental. I actually think the culture wars are where a lot of the voting populace's attention is. So yeah, but I think people on the left who are like, why are you focusing on, canceled books and Dr. Seuss and things like that? When Donald Trump is doing this, and it's like, well, if you actually don't want Donald Trump in office, then
Don't do
I'd probably be making the
that.
Democratic Party a little bit different in terms of its messaging, right? There's a reason that like during the Dr. Seuss controversy, if you turned on Fox News, like it was on Tucker Carlson, it was on these other programs because like people were generally upset about that. Like people who grew up reading Dr. Seuss, right? And again, I'm not just talking about like canceled books. I'm also, when I think about wokeness, I'm also thinking about, promises to defund the police and things like that. Stuff that just pulls so bad even in the communities that ostensibly are supposed to be like benefiting from defund the police. So like, when you look at like what do African Americans think about the police, it's like the overwhelming majority are either content with police spending or they actually want more. It's not like most African Americans in this country want their police departments defunded. So like when you see like
Yeah.
Democratic politicians campaigning on that, and then you see Donald Trump campaigning on like law and order, other things, the border people want a tight border. So it's, I would hope that what we're seeing now is sort of like people like Gavin Newsom, I think, trying to do like kind of like a MAGA left kind of thing. That would probably be the path forward if I was, someone advising the Democratic Party. I'd say like stop with the the indigenous land acknowledgement, stop with, you know, accusing half the country of racism. I don't think that's like a winning electoral strategy. Now, as far as your second question, this is the way I think about sort of the current moment, right? So I think wokeness is very much kind of like mold in a basement. So like if I had mold in my basement, let's say it's festering there, it's covering the walls, eventually it gets into the radiators, goes into the radiators, and now all of a sudden I have mold in my upstairs, in my kitchen, and whatever. I think that is what has kind of happened between 2010 and 2020 with it sort of like peaking, where it's like stuff that I really only encountered on campus in the early 2010s. It was all of a sudden like showing up in the New York Times newsroom in Hollywood. And I distinctly remember talking to people who are not in academia in the early 2010s about like stuff I was noticing. And they were just like, oh, this sounds like crazy. And then, 5, 6, 7 years later, they're telling me about the same shit when they have to sit through, a mandatory HR meeting where slides from Robin DiAngelo's book are, on the PowerPoint. So like with mold in a basement, I could bring in exterminator to like sort of clean my kitchen, clean my living room. But like, unless you deal with what's in the basement, it's probably going to resurface at some point, right? So I think like, Trump campaigned on an anti-woke platform. You have people like Pete Hegseth who are like, exterminating wokeness in the military. Universities, I think, are being a bit more careful, particularly the ones who have had their funding cut. So, like, all of a sudden, at whatever Brown or Cornell, it's not like the DEI office anymore. It's like the Office of Civic Engagement. But again, like, look at the top 50 universities, look at the sociology departments, look at anthropology departments, look at the scholarship, look at who's being hired. It's not like this has like gone away. It's still gonna, I think, continue in the original places that have exported it, with universities like being a central place for that.
So it doesn't seem like one of the root causes of higher education is open to internal reform.
Right.
Um, but is that going to just contribute to the continuing irrelevancy of the humanities in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a part. I think there's a lot of reasons why people aren't being English majors right now. But I think that's certainly part of it. Like I've actually had students, because I taught at English at Cornell and other universities, who told me that in other English courses, the English course was essentially like, here's a book and like we're gonna talk about like why it's problematic or why it's morally good. And we're gonna use like the theories of Marxism and Judith Butler to do that. And like, so people who actually like reading novels and stuff like that, they think they're going to like enroll in an English course and it's going to be like, let's read, books that we think are amazing and talk about like aesthetic concerns. And then they sign up and like most of what they read isn't even fiction. It's again like Judith Butler and Karl Marx, and Frederick Jameson and stuff. I think that's part of the reason why people who actually might otherwise gravitate towards the arts like hate them, because it's not really like a fun way to appreciate books and things like that.
Well,
Um,
in my own field, history, it's gone more and more towards social and cultural history, and not quite to the identity politics extent of some other fields. But it used to be like, military history is a very popular field. We had a course on World War II. I mean, you could have 300 students take that course, or World War I is a popular course. When I arrived here, we had peace studies, but we had no war being taught. Um, so you're right. There's the things that 90% of people are interested in, and then there are the things that tenured professors are interested in.
yeah, it's so explicit in English, right? Because if you look at like what is selling among normal people, it's like genre fiction, right? So it's like romance fiction, mystery fiction. It's people like James Patterson, those sorts of folks. And then you go on a college campus, it's very rare for an English professor to be teaching like genre fiction. It's actually kind of looked down upon as, like not as intelligent, as predictable, things like that, right? Which is really unfortunate because it's again like from a practical side, if you're running an English department, you'd probably want to have an abundance of courses that, are like teaching what people actually want to read instead of um, assigning some book that is really not entertaining, but is communicating some sort of point about racism that you want to communicate.
Well, and in nonfiction, you've got, I mean, biography, just David McCullough, Ron Chernow,
Totally.
Hamilton then becomes a musical because he read that 1,000-page biography, which was a bestseller on a beach vacation. I mean, people eat that stuff up, people of all backgrounds. Well,
Hmm.
I've enjoyed having you, Adam. We've got a couple of people online. We can open it up for questions for our author. Oh, oh, they're connecting. Randy?
I'm here. I'm here. I was waiting for Ken to come on.
I was struggling with my technology.
Yeah. So, well, I'll let Ken follow up if it's okay. I'll go first. So, as I was listening to your talk, one of the things that I'm always interested in, um, so brief background about myself. I'm an organization theorist by training. I work in a college of business. So some of the economic dimensions that you all were talking about are very interesting to me. I also like to think about the way organizations sort of respond to these broader political environments. If I heard you right, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're saying that there might be a slight misread with respect to the way these organizations are responding to broader political dynamics. They're getting only a subset of it, much to the detriment of the much broader market that they have to work with. So What you see any path forward through that, or what advice would you give to a long organization or a large organization that might be misreading what their market base actually looks like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm always hesitant to offer any sort of like, like broad, grand sweeping advice. It would actually help me is there sort of like, could you maybe talk more about like the specific situation you're in or kind of like more specifically what you're thinking about? Like, are you thinking about, I don't know, like George Floyd's death goes viral and then all of a sudden, like, an organization on campus is like, what should we do to fight racism or what have you?
Yeah. So I think I'm not thinking of any specific situation per se. What I'm thinking about, and I really apologize if this observation is too low resolution, but I haven't thought about the specific dynamics. One thing that I've been tinkering with lately is thinking a little bit about consumer boycotts as a mechanism of political voice. So, and we see this all the time. There's a large business literature on this, but what happens is sort of organizations will reflexively respond to these boycotts, but the boycotts are only a very small segment of what the market actually is speaking about. And this isn't a partisan specific thing. This lands at both sides of the aisle. So I guess I'm wondering, with respect to some of the books that you're talking about, do you think that there's actually a sweeping market signal to these organizations to do what they're doing? Or are they responding to a narrow set of interests that might be amplified by, say, social media?
Yeah, so I think it's the latter. So like the way I think depending on the situation. But my understanding, having interviewed people, is that, and I think there's actually a very similar dynamic when you see like students organize and like demand something of a university, whether it's like canceling a speaker or what have you. Like these people in publishing will see like social media activity of all these people saying like, if you publish this book, then we're not going to buy any more books from Penguin Random House, or this book is problematic. We need to stop it. But I mean, this is such a small percentage of the reading public, right? So like in the case of some of the books I talk about, you can actually look at a book that has been criticized by these folks online and sometimes taken up in like a place like the New York Times. You look at that criticism, and if you were just looking at that, you would be like, wow, like everyone thinks this book is racist and problematic. But then you can actually sort of control for this by like going to Amazon, for example, and looking at reviews. So like I talk about one book in particular is this book called A Birthday Cake for George Washington, which a lot of people said was racist and whitewashing slavery and stuff. And again, if you were only listening to those people, you'd be like, oh, wow, this is as clear as day, this problematic book. But then you go to Amazon, it's got like a 4.2 out of 5 rating. And a lot of people are like, there's some people who are like, yeah, I think there's some problematic things here, but overall, I actually think it's a great book. Some people even saying like, I think this is a great sort of anti-racist book. So, I don't know to what extent that answers your question, but as far as my conversations with publishers go, I think they actually overestimate the degree to which like this loud but influential like minority of people is actually like representative of the broader book buying public.
Is it because these people that are criticizing are in the same social class? Maybe the
Yeah.
same kind of people. I mean, the people that run publishing companies they probably came from elite colleges or universities. They knew these kind of people. They're like, well, these are our people, less
Yeah.
contact with regular people.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I asked a president of a big five publisher explicitly. I was like, kind of like, what do you do, or what would happen if you got this pressure, but it was coming from the right? If, people on Twitter who are conservative were saying like, don't publish this book. This book is, offensive to our Christian religious values. And he explicitly told me, and I write about this in the book, he was just kind of like, yeah, their anger and stuff doesn't really like affect what we do. he's like, often actually, like a lot of my colleagues will take pride in publishing a book that upsets people on the right because it feels like they're doing good progressive work. If a Christian Republican is upset about, their book about gay characters or what have you. Um, think hypothetically, I think like the right, if it sort of mirrored the tactics of the left in terms of like putting more pressure on publishers, I think you could probably see a swing in things, but like right now that's not something they do.
Ken, did you have a question?
Well, I did, but quite literally, Adam just answered it. So I'm going to try to rephrase it a little bit. It was about it's about motivations. And so well, first let me start by mentioning, it's been years now, but I published a book chapter. I'm a political scientist and I do media and politics and American politics mostly. And I had a book chapter a few years ago now about media consolidation. And without going into details, I'm sure you're aware of this. All media industries are natural oligopolies. And so it's not at all surprising that there are five players in book publishing because that's kind of what happens in any media industry. And so part of what that means is that the industry is pretty well insulated from economic pressures to some extent. And I was going to ask you, I'm still going to try to ask you, but maybe change a little bit based on, I think you kind of just answered it, was I wanted to ask about whether or not they have more economic motivations, that they're just listening to the loud people who are saying, hey, you can't publish this racist book, or if they're ideologically motivated themselves. And it sounds like it's more the latter than the former.
Yeah, I think so, right? So like a great example of that is I also write about this in the book, and I got to interview folks who are, really close to this. So Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life, was a massive bestseller, like 10 million plus copies sold. Just huge, huge economic incentive to continue working with Jordan Peterson. But Peterson has sort of been ostracized as a kind of like transphobe, what have you. A lot of people on the left do not like Jordan Peterson, right? So his follow-up book, 12 More Rules for Life, which isn't a political book, it's just kind of like a self-help book. That was supposed to be published by Penguin Random House Canada, and there were employees there who, even though this clearly goes against their economic interests as a company in a very massive way, because I mean, to sell even 1 million copies of a book is like a landmark feat in publishing nowadays. They tried to stop publication of his book, right? And there was a town hall where people are literally crying, like not using that metaphorically. So it's like I don't think they're faking their tears. I don't think they're like method actors. I think they're such true believers in this idea that someone like Peterson is such a threat and such a fascist and such a whatever, that to like, as they put it, allow their publisher to publish it would put them on the quote unquote wrong side of history. Like that term wrong side of history, it also came up in a letter from employees at Simon and Schuster, I think, to their publisher trying to cease publication of Mike Pence's memoir. So these are people who, I think in many ways, to your point, will go against their own company's economic interests in a very profound way, because they are like true believers in this stuff.
Yeah, I won't go up on this, but CNN tried to reform a couple of years ago. They brought in a new director of news or whatever, and then that person had a town hall with Donald Trump and then got fired almost immediately after because of the same type of uproar from inside the company. So it sounds like these media organizations are so internally driven, and that even though they face massive market pressures, well, at least on the news side, they do now.
Yeah.
Not so much, it sounds like on the book publishing, that they're willing to go against their own interests.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not like, I'm not friends with Barry Weiss, and, I've done Coleman's podcast, which is on the Free Press and stuff. But when I saw that, what did she get appointed editor-in-chief of like MSNBC or something recently?
Of CBS.
CBS, right? So, I kind of interpreted that as, maybe perhaps ideological to a certain extent, but I would assume the bigger reason is like she has proved that you can be very profitable publishing a broad range of views in a way that is no longer being fulfilled by places like the New York Times. So like, I mean, I think I would conceive of that as like a good sign for things to come. And I was kind of surprised that that happened to her, especially, like in she hasn't been out of the New York Times that long, and the Free Press is not that old. But I definitely think there is, a counter market for people who are going to have a spine, right? Like I know John McWhorter came up earlier. It's absolutely true that Ibram X. Kennedy has made an egregious amount of money and has keeps turning out New York Times bestsellers, but like, McWhorter's book, Woke Anti-Racism or Woke Racism, whatever it's called, like that was also a New York Times bestseller.
Yeah, great. Great conversation. Thank you for being with us, Adam, and good luck with your next ventures.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you guys having me.
All right. Take care.
Take care.
Thank you.